Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about Rachel's arguments against relativism, right? In the last lecture, I said, well, Rachel's thinks he can show that the arguments people usually give for relativism aren't that great, but he wants to go further. He wants to give us reasons to think relativism is actually false. Well, what are those? How does Rachel's want to argue against relativism? The main way that Rachel's wants to argue against relativism, the main strategy he sort of pursues is to argue that, well, if we really accept, we can't really accept cultural relativism. We might say that we accept it, but if we really think through what cultural relativism would commit us to, we don't actually believe that. Well, why not? Well, Rachel's the big one. He says, well, look, if cultural relativism in sense 4 or some of these other senses was true, then you could never say that anything another culture does is wrong. And the relativist might say, well, yeah, Rachel's, yeah, that's what I think. Why is that such a big deal? And Rachel's would push back, you don't really want to say that, though. I mean, think of it this way, right? If I ask you, was the Holocaust wrong? Hopefully every single one of you would say, yes, that's terrible. That's practically the definition of something that's wrong, right? But Rachel's would say, can you really say that if you're a cultural relativist? Germans, or at least enough of them in the 1930s, thought that it was perfectly okay to conquer your neighbors and murder certain people based on their race or religion. Well, that's what they thought. That's what their culture says. We can't judge it wrong, right? If you're really a relativist, you would have to say that. But Rachel's would say nobody is going to really accept that. Look, I mean, times went on a bit, so it's hard to think that there would be any living Nazi war criminals. But, imagine that you found out the man living down the street from you was a concentration camp guard or something like that. You wouldn't just shrug your shoulders and be like, oh, well, where he was from at that time and place, they thought that was okay. I guess Fritz is okay, I'm whatever, who am I to judge, right? You would not think that. You would think that what he has done is terrible. And if relativism in the strong, interesting sense is true, you couldn't make that judgment. If you really want to judge that things like the Holocaust are wrong, you cannot be a relativist, at least not in the sense that says there are no universal moral truths. Or think about it this way, right? We all think, or at least most of us hopefully think, that our culture has made progress on some issues. We, 150 years ago, slavery was legal, right? Well, let me revise that, 160. You guys can tell I'm getting old, right? Well, look, not only is it not legal anymore, we think it's horribly immoral. A little over 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. Not only do we think that women ought to be able to vote, we think it's horribly immoral that society ever kept women from voting. Well, why do I bring this up? Well, think about it this way. America in 1850 or America in 1900 is in a very real sense a different culture than America in 2019, 2020, or whenever, right? For us to say that we've made progress, we're saying that we get things better. We are better on some moral issues than were Americans in 1850 or 1900. We are judging this different culture, America of 1850, America of 1900, as being worse than ours on some moral respects. If you are a cultural relativist, you can't do that. That means that if you're a cultural relativist, you can't talk about our culture making progress. All you could say is, well, one time they thought this, we don't much like it, but who's to say, right? I'm going to bet when it comes to these issues like women's rights, slavery, basic human freedoms, you are not going to want to say that. And if you don't, then Rachel's would say you can't really be a relativist. The past is a different culture. To say that we do things better than they do means that we think our morality, the morality of our culture, is better. Well, if you're a cultural relativist, you can't say that. You can't talk about progress. If you're a cultural relativist, you can't condemn any culture ever, not even the Nazis. Rachel's will say, and I think he's right, most of us do think there's progress. Most of us do think what the Nazis did was wrong, and those are both good things. If you're a relativist, you can't do that anymore. That's very good reason to reject relativism, at least in this strong sense 4, that says there are no universal moral truths. But look, you know, as I said, I do want to give relativism a fair shake. So, someone might throw out this response to Rachel's. They might say, well, look, even you, James Rachel's, admit that different cultures have different moral codes. Well, guess what? Making an ethical argument or having an ethical discussion requires that we can find principles the other person agrees with, right? Well, if different cultures have different moral codes, then we aren't going to be able to find such principles. We're not going to be able to make ethical arguments with members of other cultures or even have discussions. So in a sense, what we're trying to do in an ethics class just won't be possible if the other person is in a different culture from us. So, you know, even one which you, Rachel's, admit is true is enough to say that what we're trying to do in ethics, find common moral principles that other people can agree with, maybe that might not be possible. At least if those other people really are different from us, if they're in other cultures. So how would you respond to that? Well, look, I think this response, I think this challenge is too hasty, and Rachel's does say something about it. Ask yourself this: does the fact that different societies have different moral codes show that there are no common moral principles? It doesn't, right? I mean, look, think of it this way, right? There's a good chance if you go and talk to a random person on the street and ask them about a controversial moral issue, you know, say something like abortion or physician-assisted suicide or something like that, right? There's a good chance that you and that person will disagree. But do you think that would show that you and the average person on the street completely disagree, that you share no common moral principles? I bet that there are some moral principles that you and any random member of the public would share, right? You know, if you go out and ask somebody on the street, is it okay to boil a baby alive? That's not my example. That's from this woman, Elizabeth Anscombe, we'll talk about later. But if you ask them that, you can be pretty darn sure they'll say, yeah, that's wrong. And in the same way, you might ask, well, just because our society disagrees with other societies on some moral judgments, does that mean that it disagrees with them on all of them? Are there no common principles? That's certainly not true. In fact, Rachel's will say often when it looks like, even when there's a really different moral judgment, you can often find a common moral principle at work. Think about the Greeks and Galatians, right? Now, the Greeks think, burn your dead, the Galatians say, eat them. Well, but do they really disagree that much on moral issues, right? For both the Greeks and the Galatians, what they're doing is they're trying to honor their dead, right? They're trying to show respect for the dead. It just so happens that how you show respect for the dead in Greek culture is much different than Galatian culture, right? You know, if this Persian emperor had asked the Greeks or the Galatians, well, would you just throw your dead on a trash heap and leave them? The Greek and the Galatian would be equally outraged, right? Both of them agree you should treat the dead with respect. It's just what that means is different for a Greek and a Galatian. For a Greek, it means cremation, burning your dead. For a Galatian, it means eating them. Or think about the Inuit, or as Rachel calls them, the Eskimo, right? In Inuit society, the travelers find, oh, well, they will leave infants to die. And they'll prefer to leave female infants to die, right? They'll let the elderly die. We don't do any of that stuff. We have arguments about how generous Social Security should be. So doesn't that mean that we and the Inuit fundamentally disagree with, on the value of human life, right? No, of course not, right? Think about, as Rachel says, the conditions these people live in. When they were first contacted by Europeans, they live in about the most brutal environment you can possibly live in. Why did they let the elderly die? Well, because they simply could not feed them. They valued human life, but if they tried to feed people who couldn't provide for the community, everyone might starve. It's not that they value human life less than we do, it's just that they're forced to make a really brutal choice that our society doesn't have to make. Not only that, I bet you if we face the same position, if it's like, well, everyone in society is going to starve unless we kill everyone over 60, these sorts of hypotheticals get harder as I get older and older, by the way. This was funny when I was 30, it's not funny at 40. But back to my point. My point being, if we face that choice, we wouldn't like it, we would do it. There is no doubt in my mind. Well, and think about the practice of leaving infants to die. Again, Rachel points out they only do this when there are famines. It's not that they value the lives of their children less than we do. Once again, they just simply face a situation where they can't feed them all, or at least they did. If we faced the same brutal situation, we would probably do the same thing. Well, why is it, don't they seem to value men more than women? Isn't that wrong? Don't we disagree with that? Well, the reason that they leave female babies to die and not men, remember, men hunt. Men are much more likely to face early death, to be killed in the process of hunting. Well, if it wasn't the female babies they killed, they would face this horrible gender imbalance. Again, they're just facing an awful choice we don't face. That's why they do this. So even with the Eskimo, we can find common values at work. And it's pretty easy to find common values at work in the case of the Greeks and the Galatians, which seems so different to start with. And here's the thing Rachel's will say, though. Rachel's will say, well, it's not just in these cases, but as a matter of fact, there are certain fundamental moral principles you can expect any society to have. Well, why is that? Well, Rachel's will say, and I think he's right about this, there are certain fundamental moral principles, stuff like don't kill without a very good reason, tell the truth, things like that, respect others' property. If you don't have basic rules like that, your society just isn't going to last, right? A society that allowed people to kill other people anytime they felt about it, what's going to happen to that society? Right? If we lived in that society, one of two things would happen to us. Either we'd get killed, or we would say to ourselves, oh goodness, let's run away from this society and find a society where people don't just kill each other at the drop of a hat, right? Or maybe a third thing, maybe a bunch of us would get together, leave the society and say, let's just form our own where we have this no killing rule. That'll be better for everybody, right? So Rachel's will say, we can expect some common moral principles. Even if societies might disagree on some things, we can expect some common principles because societies that don't have those common principles aren't going to last. Same goes, think again like with truth telling, right? If we don't have a rule that people should generally tell the truth, we're never going to be able to get anything done, right? If you can't trust what people say. If we don't have a rule that you generally respect others' property, again, we're not going to have a functioning society. So, not only will we find that there are certain basic principles that all societies have in common, Rachel says, and I think there's good reason to think he's right, societies need to have these principles or they just won't last. They won't be stable. All right. So ultimately then Rachel says, not very good reasons to think that cultural relativism is true, at least not in an interesting sense of the term. Very good reasons to think it's false. But I don't want to stop on that negative note. Because I think Rachel's believes that there are some positive lessons of cultural relativism, and I think there are too, and I want to make sure to draw those out. And one of those is that we shouldn't assume that our own moral code is necessarily superior. Look, the claim that there is a universal truth in ethics is not the same as saying, well, we necessarily have gotten that universal truth right. We should be very aware of the fact that our culture might have gotten certain things wrong. And when we approach other cultures, we should be very open to the fact they might have gotten some things right that we get wrong. So we ought to see what we can learn from other cultures. We ought to ask ourselves, when they do some weird thing, why do they do this? In some cases, it just might be they share a moral value with us, and they just, implement it differently given their environment. But even in cases where we really disagree, we ought to ask ourselves, how sure are we that we're right? Now, in some cases, the Holocaust, for instance, we're going to be, and we should be, very sure that we're right and the other society is wrong. But, in other cases, maybe that's not so clear, right? We might see that another culture does something a different way. We might decide, well, maybe they're right about that, right? Sometimes we're clear that other cultures are doing something wrong. But in a lot of cases when that's not so clear, we should give them the benefit of the doubt and try to learn from them. Second point, we should treat other cultures with respect and some degree of tolerance. Now look, the lessons of history tell us what happens when we don't do this, right? Now look, I say some degree of tolerance because we can't go too far with this, right? If the culture, the next country over, is trying to invade us, if they want to wage a war on us, it doesn't mean we have to let them do that. Toleration has limits, but within limits, we should tolerate other cultures. Neither of those claims are the same as the claim that there is no universal truth in morality, though. Those can be true. We can learn some positive lessons from relativism without going to this radical claim, there is no universal truth in morality. Okay, so hopefully you guys, understand Rachel's argument against relativism as well as some possible positive lessons of relativism.